You don't need to be louder and bolder to be more persuasive at work. Tiny shifts in your word choices can have a dramatic impact on how your ideas, requests, and feedback is received. So grab your cup of tea and let's talk about 3 everyday words with high impact for your communication. What I've realized about the most persuasive communicators is that they aren't necessarily the most articulate. They're the most intentional with the words that they use. And through my 15 years working in marketing and communications, and more recently learning about neurolinguistics programming, I have learned to fall in love with the power of words and how they can be used to really intentionally form how your ideas are received, how people experience interacting with you or your idea. In my earlier episode, I talked about 10 words and phrases to consider cutting from your vocabulary at work. And in that episode, I presented a few alternatives to those words as well. But in today's episode, I really want to focus on the words to add to your communication and the 3 quick wins that you can have in that space. And the first word that I want to start with is the word because. Don't assume that your ideas, your opinions, and your requests are going to be well received because they simply speak for themselves. They don't. You do. And when you present your ideas with a focus on also presenting the reason behind those ideas, then people are more likely to accept this. And there is actually some really interesting science to support this as well. In quite a famous experiment in the 1970s, the Harvard psychologist Ellen Langer set up this experiment in libraries where the participants in the experiment were instructed to approach a line for the photocopier and request to cut into the line. And in that experiment, the participants in the research were divided into 3 different groups. And they were assigned something that they would say to the existing people in the line when they tried to cut in. So the first scenario was that they gave no reason at all. They said, "Excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the Xerox machine?" In the second scenario, they would provide a more meaningful reason. They would say, "Excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the Xerox machine because I am in a rush?" In the third scenario, they gave a reason, but it was a low information reason. They said, "Excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the Xerox machine because I have to make copies?" And this experiment had some really interesting results. It showed that when there was no reason given at all, the compliance was relatively low. It was approximately 60%. When there was a real reason given, when they said, "I am in a rush," for example, the compliance was relatively high. That was 90+%. And in the third scenario, where they used the word because and they explained that they had to make copies, this was actually almost the same as the second scenario when they actually gave a more meaningful reason. This was still at the 90% plus range. And what this experiment showed was that this small linguistic trigger can have a big impact on compliance to the idea. And what was really interesting about that research was that the compliance was still so strong in the scenario where the reason that was given was a really low information reason that didn't have a lot of meaning or logic to it. So it shows that these linguistic triggers are this form of casual connective that assumes that there is some sort of logic behind that. So when we hear a word like because, we expect that there is a rational reason to follow. So in a way, the potential scrutiny that we might have about something is relaxed because we believe that reason is going to be logical. And this is something that marketers and skilled communicators and copywriters, for example, have known for a really long time. And some of them are a lot more outward about their use of it. So, take, for example, a brand like L'Oreal and their "Because You're Worth It" tagline. It's also worth noting that this is probably going to work best in a scenario where there is some baseline politeness and trust, and it's not related to something that is a really high investment or a high risk, as we can see through that experiment example as well. So, the next time that you're in a meeting or you're delivering a pitch or you're presenting, consider integrating more of the word "because" and see how this might shift how your ideas are received. The second everyday word that I recommend that you consider adding more to your communication at work is the word "and." This is a word that I have talked about before when I shared my episode on 9 words to consider removing from your email, 9 words and phrases. And this is because the power of the word "and" is a really helpful alternative to other words that can sometimes hinder our ability to connect with other people. And one of those words in particular that I've talked about on this channel before is the word "but." And that is because in a lot of scenarios, the word "but" has this negation effect to the person that is hearing it. So, for example, in a scenario where you have said something constructive and then you follow up with the word "but," it means that everything that you said prior to that immediately sounds insincere to the person that is hearing it. It is this really small word that almost flips the switch as this mental trigger that means that we become really alert to everything that is said after that. That is the part that we are going to focus on, as opposed to the first part that might have been a little bit more positive. And this is where the power of "and" can be really effective because it creates space for two ideas to be able to exist together. So you might have, say, a positive comment, and you might have a comment that is more constructive, but you are bridging those two comments with a word like "and" instead of a word like "but." And that can have a completely different effect on the person that is hearing it. So, for example, instead of saying "I see your point, but," you might say "I see your point, and." What this does is that it lowers the defensiveness of that person. It creates a space that feels a lot more collaborative. And this is an idea that also became really popular in the theatre space. It's used a lot in improvisation, where to build on what was already taking place, the actors would use phrases like "yes and," which means that they are accepting the original idea instead of shutting it down, and they are also adding to it. They are building upon that idea. So remember that a word like "but" is most often this adversative language, whereas a word like "and" is an additive language. It is constructive, it is collaborative, it can be built upon. And my tiny word number 3 to add to your communication is the word "yet." Now, this is an idea that has become increasingly more and more popular across disciplines and also across different ages as well. And that is because the power of "yet" is that it transforms this fixed mindset about your current circumstances or your current abilities into a future possibility. So, for example, instead of saying, "I'm not good at giving presentations," that is transformed into, "I'm not good at giving presentations yet." And that is a completely different scenario. And this links really nicely to the work of Carol Dweck, which I love to talk about on this channel. And I talked about recently in my episode about the other side of you and this idea of a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. Because it is the growth mindset that assumes that your talents and your skills and abilities are something that can be developed. It is not something that relies on your natural born abilities or your natural born talent. It is something that if you work on and that you're prepared to fail and be resilient in, that you can develop over time. That is opposed to the fixed mindset that believes that your skills and your talents are set and that they are natural born, for example. And that is where the power of yet becomes so powerful, because it is a really lovely 3-letter word that can help to add more of that idea of a growth mindset into your conversations. It shows progress, it shows adaptability, it shows resilience, it shows your learning orientation. And your brain responds differently to these identity statements as opposed to closed statements. So the next time you're at work, consider adding a few more yets into your conversations, maybe in your meetings, maybe in your presentations, to highlight more of your future focus, your learning orientation, your adaptability, and see how this can potentially shift how your communication is received. Thanks so much. For more on the 9 words and phrases to consider cutting from your emails, then check out my earlier episode on this topic. I'll see you in the next episode.